Have you ever, like, noticed yourself doing something and thought, whoa, that's totally something my mom or dad would do? Like a little quirk, a way you react to something, even a way of thinking.
It's fascinating, right? That sense of like inherited patterns.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of heritability, how traits get passed down.
It's a concept that's been around for ages, but even today, it's a bit of a puzzle, you know?
For sure. So to really unpack it, we're going to the source, literally. We've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on heritability.
Consider this our guidebook, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And what we're going to explore is not just the basic genetic stuff, although we will touch on that,
yeah.
but also, like, how do scientists even try to measure this passing down of traits?
And the big one,
Mhm.
how much is it our genes? How much is it the environment? That whole nature versus nurture thing?
Exactly. Plus, there's some pretty deep philosophical questions that pop up when you start thinking about all this.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be just like, lecture, no.
No, no, it's more about like tracing how our understanding has changed over time.
And like, what are the controversies? What does it all mean for how we understand ourselves and the world around us?
Get ready for some aha moments.
Totally. Okay, so first things first. What makes something a heritable trait in the first place?
Well, at the simplest level, it's when offspring resemble their parents more than they resemble a random person.
Okay, so like basic family resemblance. You see it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. That's what Darwin focused on even before we had modern genetics. He looked at stuff like height, weight, those observable traits, what we now call phenotypes.
Right, like that kid has his father's nose kind of thing. But modern biology takes it way further.
Oh, yeah. Now we're all about the genes, the actual transmission process. So the term heritability came about as a way to measure how much of that resemblance is due to the genes being passed down.
So it's about quantifying it, putting a number on it.
Exactly. Like, how predictable is it that a certain trait will show up in the next generation?
But the entry makes this point, and it's really important. Heritability is about populations, not individuals.
Yeah, this trips people up all the time.
So it's not like saying 70% of your height comes from genes.
Right. It's saying 70% of the differences in height we see in this group is because of genetic differences between them.
Ah, so it's about the variation within a group, not about one person's development.
Precisely. And I think that's where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from. Genes are obviously crucial for development, no doubt.
Right.
But population genetics is all about those big picture patterns of how traits get passed on in a whole group.
Whereas molecular biology is like zooming in on the actual DNA.
Exactly. Different levels of analysis, but they inform each other.
The entry gives an example from medical genetics to show this.
Yeah. Like you might notice a disease running in families that suggests heritability.
Right.
So then they do molecular studies, try to find the specific gene involved, understand what it does, maybe how a mutation causes a problem.
Ah, so that's how they connect the dots.
Right. Then, once they know the molecular stuff, they can go back to population genetics. They use heritability analysis to see how common that gene variant is in the whole population.
And how much it actually influences the disease risk for the group. It's like a full circle thing.
It is. It's amazing how it all connects.
Okay, so we kind of know what heritable traits are and the
Yeah.
way scientists think about them. But how do they actually measure this heritability in a population?
Well, we have to start with Mendel and his peas, right? Those classic experiments with traits that are either like smooth or wrinkled
Yeah,
peas.
right. High school biology flashback.
Totally. But when it comes to heritability, a lot of the philosophical discussion focuses on traits that are continuous,
Yeah.
like height in humans or blood pressure or even some behavioral tendencies. Those aren't just on-off, they're on a spectrum.
Okay, so how do you figure out how much of that variation is due to genes?
So for these continuous traits, they use this statistical method called analysis of variance, ANOVA for short.
And-
It's all about trying to figure out what proportion of the total variation we see in a trait is due to genetics. And the result is a heritability measure, which is a number between 0 and 1.
So 0 means genes have basically nothing to do with it, and 1 means it's all genes.
Basically. The entry gives this cool thought experiment with cloning. Imagine you could clone two people with totally different heights, then you swap their environments.
So the clone of the tall person grows up where the short person did, and vice versa.
Exactly. If, even after the swap, their heights end up similar to their originals, that points to a strong genetic influence.
Makes sense, even if we can't actually clone people. So in real life, with actual humans, how do you separate the genes from the environment?
Twin studies. That's the gold standard.
Right, right. Because identical twins share all their genes, and fraternal twins share about half.
Exactly. So the logic is, if a trait has high heritability, identical twins should be way more similar to each other in that trait than fraternal twins.
Because their genes are the bigger factor?
Precisely. But if it's low heritability, if the environment is more important, then the two types of twins should be about equally different.
That's pretty clever.
It is. There's also another method, looking at parents and their kids.
Like, tall parents tend to have tall kids.
Exactly. If you plot the average height of parents against the average height of their kids, the slope of that line can actually give you an estimate of heritability.
Really?
Yeah, it's wild. Like a slope near 1 means genes are super important. But of course, this is all within a specific population and environment.
Right, right. Always got to remember the context. Okay, so we've talked about how they study heritability. Now, let's get into the math. The entry has this equation, and I got to be honest, it's a little intimidating.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's actually pretty logical when you break it down. So we start with something called phenotypic variance, which is basically the total variation we see in a trait and population. They use VP to represent it.
Okay.
And the simplest version is VP is equal to genetic variance plus environmental variance. So like VP plus a VE.
So the total variation is just the genetic differences plus the environmental differences. Makes sense.
Right. But it turns out it's not always that simple.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, because genes and environment can actually interact in all sorts of ways. So we have to introduce these ideas of broad sense heritability, which is like the total proportion of the variance that's due to any kind of genetic influence.
Okay.
And then there's narrow sense heritability, which focuses specifically on what's called additive genetic variance.
Wait, additive. What's that?
So imagine multiple genes all contributing to height. Each tall version of a gene adds a bit to the final height, no matter what other genes you have. That's additive.
Okay.
But sometimes one version of a gene can totally mask the effect of another version at the same spot on the DNA.
Like, even if you have one tall and one short version, you might still end up tall because the tall one dominates.
Exactly. That's dominance variance. And together, these additive and dominance variances, they make up the total genetic variance.
So it's more complicated than just adding up all the genes.
Yeah, it gets messy. And there's even more. There's gene interaction, where the effect of one gene depends on what other genes you have. That's epistatic variance.
Yeah.
And then there's gene-environment interaction, where the same genes might have different effects depending on the environment.
Oh, right. Like, maybe a gene makes you taller only if you have good nutrition.
Exactly. And then, to make things even more interesting, there's gene-environment covariation,
Meaning
your genes and your environment aren't totally independent. Like, if you have genes for musical talent, you might be more likely to grow up in a musical family.
so the environment kind of reinforces the genes.
It can, yeah. So the full equation for phenotypic variance is a bit of a mouthful. It's got all these components in it.
Okay, so definitely not as simple as we first thought.
Nope. But the cool thing is, depending on what you're studying, different parts of that equation become more important. Like for evolution, the additive genetic variance is key because that's what gets passed down most predictably.
Right, that makes sense.
They even have something called realized heritability, which is all about predicting how a trait will change in a population when you apply selective pressure, like in breeding programs.
So lots of different ways to slice and dice this heritability thing.
Sure.
All right, let's move on to humans specifically. We talked about twin studies earlier, but what about the molecular stuff? How did DNA change the game?
Oh, man. Watson and Crick discovering the double helix was huge. It's like, for the first time, we knew what the fundamental unit of inheritance was.
The blueprint, right?
Exactly. And that opened up a whole new world of genomic research. Eventually, we got to the point where we could analyze individual DNA in incredible detail, looking at these things called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
SNPs, that's those tiny variations in the DNA that make each of us unique.
Precisely. And we got technology, SNP chips that could analyze tons of these SNPs all at once. So scientists were like, let's scan the entire genome and see what's linked to what traits. Enter GWS, genome-wide association studies.
So comparing the DNA of people with a certain trait to those without looking for differences.
Exactly. The hope was This would nail down the specific genes behind heritability estimates from twin studies and all that.
But the entry says the early results were disappointing.
Yeah, because they found that the individual SNPs, they usually only explained a tiny fraction of the total variance, like way less than what the twin studies suggested.
So what happened?
Well, they started thinking maybe it's not one gene, but a ton of genes, each with a small effect that all add up. So they came up with these things called polygenic risk scores, or PGS.
So instead of looking for the gene for height, it's more like all these genes nudge you a little bit taller or shorter.
Precisely. And they came up with SNP-based heritability to try and capture the total effect of all the SNPs they could measure.
And how does that compare to the twin study heritability?
Well, that's where the missing heritability problem comes in. For a lot of traits, especially behavioral ones, the SNP-based heritability is way lower than the twin study heritability.
So there's still a gap, like we're not accounting for all the heritability we thought was there.
Exactly. And it's led to a lot of debate, even philosophical debate.
Speaking of which, the entry goes deep on those philosophical issues. Let's start with the critiques of traditional heritability analysis, like the stuff that came up in the 70s and 80s.
Ah, yes. Back then, there were some heated arguments, especially around things like IQ and race. And the people who were saying genes are super important, they often pointed to twin studies and heritability estimates as evidence.
But not everyone was convinced.
No, not at all. There were a lot of critiques, and Richard Lewontin, he was a major voice in that. In 1974, he wrote this paper that really changed the game.
What was his main point?
He basically said that the whole method of analysis of variance, the ANOVA, it can't really tell us what we think it tells us.
In what way?
Well, he said things like gene interaction, where genes affect each other's effects, and gene-environment interaction, where genes work differently in different environments, and gene-environment covariation, where genes and environments are linked.
Okay, lots of interactions and stuff going on.
Yeah, and he said these things aren't negligible, they're super important, but ANOVA kind of ignores them. So trying to separate the genetic part from the environmental part is just not that simple.
So the neat little equation, it doesn't capture the full picture.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Lewontin also emphasized that heritability is a population thing, not an individual thing.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
And he was a big fan of this idea of norms of reaction, which
Well-
is like looking at how different genes produce different ranges of traits depending on the environment.
So a more nuanced view than just saying this much is genes, this much is environment.
Totally. And after Lewontin, a bunch of other philosophers and biologists jumped on board, basically saying, yeah, broad heritability measures, they're not that helpful.
But were there counter-arguments? Like people defending heritability?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people said, look, you just got to be careful how you interpret these numbers. They're population averages, not individual destinies.
Which is true, but
But, as some critics pointed out, that message doesn't always come across clearly in the research or in how people talk about it.
right.
Another defense was that norms of reaction, they're great in theory, but in practice, with humans, it's super hard to actually measure all the possible combinations of genes and environments.
So it's a practical limitation.
Yeah. And there's still debate today about the usefulness of heritability. Some philosophers are like, it can be useful, but only under very specific conditions. Others are like, it's fundamentally flawed. There's a whole range of views.
It's a messy concept, that's for sure.
It is. But one thing that a lot of philosophers of biology and even evolutionary biologists and population geneticists seem to agree on is that broad heritability measures, especially for complex human behavior, got to be taken with a huge grain of salt.
They're not the be-all and end-all.
Not at all. And it's interesting because the idea of heredity is like central to evolution. But some of the strongest critiques of heritability have come from people studying evolution because they're worried about oversimplifying things.
Yeah, reducing everything to genes.
Exactly. And that gene-environment covariation thing, that's a real headache.
Because it makes it look like genes are the cause when maybe it's the environment that's linked to those genes.
Yeah, like with the basketball example. If kids with genes for athleticism are also more likely to play basketball, how do you separate the two?
It's all tangled up.
It is.
Okay, so that's the traditional stuff. But now we have GWS and PGS and all that. Does that change the philosophical game?
Definitely brings up a whole new set of questions. Like with GWs, even the scientists doing it are like, hold on, are these SNPs we're finding really the cause?
Why not?
Well, there's this thing called linkage disequilibrium. It's like genes are on these chromosomes and they tend to get inherited in chunks. So the SNP that shows up as linked to a trait, it might not be the actual cause, just a neighbor that's always along for the ride.
So it's hard to pinpoint the real culprit.
Yeah. And then there's population stratification, where different groups have different frequencies of certain genes.
So if those groups also differ in the trait you're studying, you might get a false positive.
Exactly. And on top of that, even when Gita Weiss finds a link, we often don't know the actual biological mechanism, like how that gene variant actually leads to the difference in the trait.
So it's still correlation, not necessarily causation.
Right. And philosophers like John Dupree are saying Gita Weiss gives us clues, but not the full causal story.
Okay, what about PGS then? They're supposed to be good at predicting individual risk. Do philosophers buy that?
Well, it's a mixed bag. Some philosophers like Sahotra Sarkar are saying, look, PGS still suffers from the same problems as traditional heritability. Those gene interactions and stuff, they mess things up.
So they're not a magic solution.
Nope. Others, like Woodward and Kendler, are more like they're statistically useful, but they don't tell us why. They're not inherently causal.
So still no smoking gun.
Right. And there are also concerns about the idealizations in the models, the assumptions they make, which can affect how accurate they are, especially when you apply them to different populations.
So again, not a simple plug-and-play solution.
Not at all. And then there are the ethical worries, like what if people misinterpret these scores, especially for things like social behavior?
It's a minefield.
It is. So while some geneticists are optimistic about PGS, a lot of philosophers are saying, hold your horses. These don't solve the fundamental problems of figuring out what causes what. And Lewontin's problem of portability comes up again here. It's like, just because a heritability estimate or a PGS works in one population doesn't mean it'll work the same way in another.
Context matters.
Always.
All right, last but not least, that missing heritability problem.
Yeah.
What do philosophers make of that?
Well, at first people thought it was just a technical issue. Like, we need better tech, bigger studies, and we'll find those missing genes.
But some philosophers think it's deeper than that.
Yeah. Like Borat and Liu, they're suggesting maybe we're overestimating heritability in the first place, and maybe we need to tweak our SNP-based methods to capture more of the complexity.
So it's about refining the tools.
But then you have folks like Matthews and Turkheimer who are saying it's not just about the numbers. They're like, even if we close the gap statistically, will we actually be able to predict someone's traits based on their genes? Will we understand the mechanisms?
So it's about prediction and explanation, not just getting the numbers to match.
Exactly. And they're raising interesting questions about different approaches to science, like maybe there are multiple valid ways to study heritability, but they're kind of incommensurable.
So no one-size-fits-all answer.
Not really.
Well, this has been a wild ride.
Hmm.
From family resemblances to DNA, from statistics to philosophy, it's clear that heritability is a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance.
It raises some big questions about who we are, how much is nature, how much is nurture. And with all these new tools, we're only just beginning to scratch the surface.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to leave you with something to think about, if heritability is about variation within a group, what does that tell us about individual potential? About our ability to change and grow throughout our lives? That's the real deep dive.
It is. And it's a question that science and philosophy, they're going to be grappling with for a long time to come.